conversation today is diving deeply into this emotion, anger, and hopefully we will surface with new information for how to address it and clear up some common misunderstandings.
Welcome to the Sifted Wheat Podcast with Leslie Lamb, a counselor by profession, a minister of truth, and a lover of people. This is a safe place where she sets a path for others to learn how to move through hard seasons with confidence and grace, encouraging your faith, empowering your choices, and challenging your perceptions through the Word, the wisdom from years of counseling others, and her own experience of being sifted. Here's Leslie.
So the question that I received was this: Dear counselor, the Bible talks about righteous anger a good bit, but how do we as Christ followers remove anger from our hearts? And do you have any specific prayers or things to help with removing that anger? Let me start by saying thank you to the listener. This is a great question and one that we talk about in counseling very often. Anger is an age-old issue. It's the first emotion that shows up in Genesis and the next generation, and God never discredits or invalidates anger. That's an important point to make because when we talk about righteous anger, it's almost as if the only pass that we get for being angry is if it has to be justice seeking. No, sometimes life can just plain make us angry, frustrated, and upset. And here's the thing, our feelings aren't sinful. When God addressed Cain, did he say, okay, I see what the problem is. You're angry and that's a sin, so just stop it. We might interpret it that way, but that isn't at all what he said. Instead, he acknowledged the anger and he asked, why are you angry? Then he tells him, basically, I get it. You're mad and you should be. You didn't do what you knew I asked. And here's the thing, this anger, it seeks to destroy you, and your role in overcoming it is not to let it dictate your choices. And what is the very next choice that Cain makes? He murders his brother. God wasn't wrong. He also did not invalidate Cain's anger. We need to know that so that we can do the better thing than removing anger and instead learn how to have mastery over it and to move through it. I tell clients all the time that just because you think you shouldn't feel a certain way doesn't change the fact that you do. And if you don't have grace for yourself in the emotions you feel, you will suppress them rather than work through them. We need all of our emotions. They're helpful in motivating and navigating life and surviving it. Anger is a necessary emotion that points to something not being right. In the case of Cain, it pointed to the truth that he'd not been faithful or honest in his sacrifice. Why was that important? Well, played out right, he could have sat with that anger and determined what his role was in what was making him angry, and he could have seen the error of his ways. In this case, since it was the latter of his harvest, he exhibited a lack of trust in God, and he could have confessed that and sought to build trust with God to have a better experience in the future. But instead, he got mad. He saw the other person as the problem, dismissed the wise counsel he was given, and took out his anger against Abel in violence. And he made a choice that changed the trajectory of his life. We know that anger isn't a pure emotion. Very often, what lies under feelings of anger are more vulnerable emotions of sadness and fear. Why vulnerable? Well, it doesn't seem very protective to cry or to run away. So those that have more of a fight response rather than a freeze or a flight are more likely to bow up to create space between them and what is threatening. Anger isn't the problem unless it is unmanaged or uncontrolled. The problem is that we haven't been taught to tune into those other emotions in the space of anger. Rather, we just kind of let the anger take its course. God's guidance to Cain reminds us and remains good guidance today. When things don't go right, you're going to get angry. And when you do, don't let it control you, but rather learn to control or manage, if that feels too aggressive, the emotion. The point isn't that we should remove anger, as the listener suggested, but rather to understand better how to manage it. Anger managed can be very powerful, whereas anger unmanaged becomes dangerous. We don't like God's anger. We don't like that he didn't like things or have preference towards people or ideas or behaviors, or that he took actions to make things right that were aggressive and costly. But we also don't sit with what was underneath that anger. We don't sit with his word and hear his heart in these spaces. Very often in his anger, the emotion beneath is sadness. He regrets, he's heartbroken and grieved and concerned for the future of all that he created. These are his words, his explanation for what is under that anger. And these are the emotions that always encapsulated his anger. In fact, one of the most beautiful revelations that I received in reading the prophetic books chronologically was that very often the anger that was felt and stirred in him in one season with one prophet, he would allow to be addressed by another prophet for the same purpose. And more than a few times, God's anger wanted to completely remove Israel from the map. And those who always knew him and called him loving and patient and kind would discuss the results of that anger. And like any good father and leader, he would move back from the anger and move into compassion and long suffering, more in line with his character yet again. So what does that mean for us? What does that require for those of us who love Jesus and follow him as Lord? How do we navigate anger in our own lives? That is a better question. Not to discredit the listener, but so that we aren't stuck in a pattern of trying to remove something that needs to be felt and processed. So the first question that I would ask is the same question God asked Cain. Why are you angry? What has you so upset and feeling frustrated? And is there a more vulnerable emotion that needs to be acknowledged and dealt with first? Once we identify that emotion or emotions, it can be both fear and sadness at the same time. But what's underneath the anger? What makes us sad? And where does that fear come up? This should lead us into a process of examining our thoughts. Is it a person I'm angry with? Is it a choice they made that has provoked my anger? Have they made choices that have affected me? And finally, what do I believe about myself, God, and others because of my anger and sadness and fear? In a space of trauma, we might need to do this with a licensed counselor. But in our everyday moments of anger, even red hot anger, once the emotion is past, don't let the moment pass, but go back to it. That anger is pointing to something that you need to be aware of. And if you dismiss it or step over it, you will miss important information about your life story and consequently opportunities in life to shift your response for the future. Okay, so that is a lot of words, good words, but still words. And if you're like me, maybe you need a story to gain a better understanding. So here's one from my life fairly recently. I was having a good day and I was going about my business when a family member of mine interrupted my peace. She was having a bad day and decided in her stress and frustration to take it out on the safe people in her life. Usually, I can take that with a grain of salt, see it as her problem, and do my best to de-escalate the issue. Only on that day, I had not slept well the night before, was overwhelmed in my work-life family balance, and found myself screaming at her. I was irate. I was shaking, and I hated who I was becoming in that moment because it was like a switch had been hit. And I was having an out-of-body experience, unbelieving and seemingly unable to control my voice, my tone. This is what we call a trigger response. After we both moved into our corners, not without fire and fight in the midst of that, but later, as I sat with my feelings, I was actually still shaking and I was furious. And more than what my body was expressing, I wanted to cry. But instead of pushing the tears away, I asked myself, what just happened? Why do I want to fall apart and cry? Why did I react the way that I reacted? I invited God to help me navigate my emotions. I realized that more than being angry, underneath all of that, I was sad and I was also scared. Her response was attached to a fear I had about my influence in her life and my own temper from when she was younger. And instead of seeing her in that moment, I just saw myself and my shame and my fear that she would struggle in the same ways that I did. I worked through that shame in that space apart from her, the shame from my own choices, and recalled the work that I was doing to heal and to let go of those old patterns, not to invite them back in. And then once I was regulated, I walked back to the person and confessed my sin and apologized. That opened the space for her also to recognize her own feelings, thoughts, and choices. And we talked through a way that we could navigate that differently next time by incorporating boundaries sooner in future scenarios. Now, that is a healthier outcome of working through emotions and coming to a place of resolution and reconciliation in the present. But what if it's an anger from the past? What if it's something that keeps me in bondage and worked up no matter how many years have passed since the original event? Honestly, it's the same process. Only I have to be willing again to invite God. And if I'm mad at him, that will only make that process more difficult. So maybe the first question that I need to work through in my anger is who I think is the object of my anger. Why am I angry at them? What did I need from them that they did or didn't provide? Or what choice did they make that hurt me? Then I need to keep working through those emotions with every person that comes up in that event that surfaces with feelings of anger. It could be parents, it could be friends, it could be family, it could be teachers. And then I have to ask, what emotions also surface in that space? What am I afraid of because of that experience? And what makes me sad about that experience? Then I need to take the time to write it out. We can process in our head, but it just becomes this hamster wheel of thoughts. And writing things out helps us to release them and see them to better understand them. I can think when he touched me, I felt shame. But if I see it, I have to engage those words and the meaning attached to shame differently. And maybe I need to parse that out to more words like, I felt dirty, unworthy, disgusting. The deeper we can get into the emotions, the better we're going to understand what's happening inside in order to regulate it. It's engaging the right part of the brain connected to language and comprehension to the logical side of the brain to integrate the hemispheres for better information and thus deeper healing. And here's where I'm going to say something that might seem radical, especially in Christian circles, but don't be rushed to forgive. I think this is where forgiveness can get a bad rap and take on the name toxic forgiveness. Before I can really forgive, I have to move beyond the event and the person to the effect of their choices. I forgive so-and-so doesn't give me anything to grow from. But rather, after working through my memories and emotions, if I can say, I forgive John Doe for hurting me by forcing me to do something that felt dirty and aggressive. Well, now I'm aware of why he hurt me and how he hurt me. And my forgiveness not only releases him as a person, but also the anger that I've stored in these other emotions of feeling dirty and threatened for all of these years. It's not an easy process, but it is a necessary process. And it's far better to move through the anger than to just resist it or pretend like it doesn't exist or remove it from our hearts. But the reality is the more that we do that, the more that we get in the process of doing that, working it through with someone or on our own with the Holy Spirit, the more we be aware of what to do with our anger when we feel it. It's less likely to move to that state of escalation and more likely to give us physical promptings before we get there. And when we acknowledge that, when we recognize that, when we do as God instructed Cain, take mastery over that emotion, then it allows us to stay in control. It allows us to be empowered in our responses instead of irate or frustrated and reactive. So this is a great question. And I really hope that as you've been listening, you're thinking of your own stories of anger, your own experiences of losing it, and going back to that moment and asking yourself some of these very same questions. The point is there is no negative emotion. And I'm going to talk more about that in our next episode, because the conversation that comes up next was another question about what do we as Christians do with our anxiety and with our depression. So emotions is a great conversation. And I'm so glad that y'all are bringing these things to the table for us to discuss and to hash out and to walk through. And I hope that the listener who sent in this question found something that she could hold on to, found something that was helpful for her, and found something that brings her deeper healing. Until next time, I'm praying for your process of letting go and releasing anger and learning how to do that.